All right, hello, my name is author James Rosone, and I am here with two other incredible authors, one from Australia and one from the UK. And welcome back to another discussion on the war in Ukraine and what may come next in light of what's happening over in Europe. So most of you know I'm a thriller writer. I also dabble in sci-fi just from time to time. It's unique to see how some of the stories we write about for fun and entertainment are suddenly being played out in reality. So that's kind of an interesting segue into what it is we're going to be talking about next. So I'll go ahead and let you both talk. We'll go with TJ and let you go first.
Yeah, I'll just introduce myself. My name's TJ Slee. I write as FX Holden. My background is originally as an intelligence officer with the Australian Intelligence, and then I joined private industry and have been working in private industry for the last several years, doing corporate investigations. And the writing started as a B job, but it's now become an all-consuming pastime.
Yeah, it becomes addicting at some point, and you're just like, oh, I just gotta keep doing it. It becomes really fun, and you just get engrossed in it, and then you start to see everyone's comments and how much they love it and like it, and you just want to keep creating more and doing more. Yeah.
Yeah, they're an impatient bunch, the readers, aren't they?
Yes, they are. It's like, God, I can't write these books.
I love that
fast. You know, it's harder to write a 120,000 word book and get it out the door so quick.
Yeah.
We'll go, and then Humphrey, you want to give a quick
yes, sorry, I was thinking about the all-absorbing readers. I'm Humphrey Hawksley. I'm a journalist, and I present a book show, and I'm a thriller writer and a non-fiction writer. I wrote my first, it was called a future history book 25 years ago called Dragon Strike, which was a fictional war in Asia between the US and China. And I've written one about the US, China, and India and Russia called The Third World War. And I'm also got a thriller series that's based from a protagonist on an Alaskan protagonist on the US-Russian border, the island of Little Diomede that sits right on the border there. His name is Reiko Zena, and the fourth of that series called Ice Islands is coming out in August. And I was in the middle of doing a sequel to my Dragon Strike series called Dragon Trap, which was about how the Chinese have been planning for 25 or 30 years to do what they're doing. But when Ukraine happened, I just put the whole thing to one side and said, we've got to wait how this settles, because that's a sort of nonfiction book. So I'm heading off to do a nonfiction book down in the Baltics and around Georgia and Moldova and places like that. And I think I'll call it something like Cold Frozen, because these are the frozen conflicts that never, or Hot Frozen maybe. But this is just this week's switch. So I'm heading off there next week.
Yeah, don't forget to check out the Kosovo conflict over there between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I've actually been to Armenia a couple of times.
Armenia is definitely one of them. Yes. Yeah.
When I worked in the intelligence side of U.S. European Command, we were doing some stuff in Armenia, which was unique because the Russians are actually in Armenia too, and they actually control several of the borders. They control the the Azerbaijan border, the Iranian border, and the Turkish border for the country. And then the Armenians only control and manage the Georgian border, obviously. So, unique dynamics in that country, that's for sure.
These are all fascinating things. And I'd love to know, one of the places is, you remember the Georgian War of 2008? And Ukraine's a much bigger war than that now, but there was South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which were like the Donbass in Ukraine, that were being given their separate status. I've got no idea how those places are going at the moment. I'd just love to go there and find out what the people there are thinking.
So circling back here with Ukraine, we've done a couple of videos talking specifically about things going on in Ukraine. Going to likely probably do another one this Sunday with a retired Army colonel and a couple other individuals. And we'll dive a little deeper into specific operations inside Ukraine, what may happen next, or what a NATO response might look like if they do go in. next week. Who knows, maybe they'll go in tomorrow, who knows at this point. But one of the areas that I think is not getting discussed and people just have not really considered or thought about is how what's going on in Europe is affecting or going to affect what will likely happen in Asia, particularly between China and Taiwan and things going on in the South China Sea. While the world is distracted and being pulled into one section, one area, you can almost always bet something nefarious is happening somewhere else. It's just a good opportunity and a distraction. So one of the things I wanted to probably pose to both of you guys, and we can start with you, TJ, is this Chinese alternative banking system that they have been developing for a long time. It has been hailed, or in their eyes, it is being hailed as a alternative to SWIFT and an ability for countries to work with China in that respect. And China is a very long-term thinker. They're looking at 2049 for their centennial, anniversary of their country, and trying to figure out how do they become the world's leader in pretty much every sector. And part of that is finance. With the actions that have taken place against Russia, where we have Visa, MasterCard cutting them off, we have the US Treasury cutting them off, we have SWIFT, we've done a complete economic isolation of Russia. How do you think that's going to impact or change things with what China is doing?
I think it's interesting whenever I go to China, which I do quite frequently actually, for work, the all-pervasive nature of the Weibo WeChat system there means that nobody ever uses a credit card directly. They all just pay with their telephone. They pay through WeChat for absolutely everything. And I can see a situation where that all-pervasive system could easily be adopted by other countries like Russia. It could be adopted by Iran. And you already see Chinese banks all through Asia as you're traveling around. And setting up an alternative economy to the Western economy would certainly isolate them from a lot of the challenges that they're facing today by being cut off from that system.
Do you think if that actually happens and Russia is able to successfully get pulled into that orbit and reestablish essentially an electronic international banking system?
Well, it takes two things, doesn't it? It takes the ability, or it takes the technological ability to do it, but it also takes an incentive. And up to now, Russia hasn't had that incentive. But without the Western financial corporations operating in Russia, they suddenly need to turn to alternatives. And there's a ready-made alternative available through China.
Yeah. Do you think that is potentially a long-term bad decision on our part to essentially cut off Russia from the financial realm and subsequently force them into the Chinese orbit?
I'm not sure the world can afford for the Russian system to be cut off, and there's a lot of symbolic politics happening. So a lot of companies are saying we're suspending operations, but they're not pulling out of Russia. They're saying that they are reducing investment in Russia. That doesn't mean that they're still not present in Russia. And the situation in China would be even more so. The world is too interdependent now for us to be able to, or for anyone to be able to afford a situation where China, some countries in the Middle East, some countries in Africa, and Russia were isolated from the rest of the global economy. It would never happen in reality. So there might be a lot of symbolism, a lot of corporate heads and politicians saying that this is what we're doing, but the reality is that the trade and commerce will continue.
It's too big, yeah. And part of I understand the idea of them being isolated from the rest of the economy, but on the converse side, are we potentially becoming isolated from a large portion of the global population and an economic powerhouse at the same time? When you look at the population and GDP of China, and I don't know if India is bought into this thing yet, and then you throw in Russia, that is not a small economic, a small economic group. That is a complete absolute rival to the US and Europe. And if the Chinese, through their Belt and Road Initiative, start to get more people into it, or make that a requirement to operate factories in their country or have access to their market even, it could actually pull even more countries and organizations into it, thereby weakening SWIFT and the West's current financial structure.
Yeah, I guess the important thing to consider is that China no doubt has considered this scenario and has a mitigation strategy, because unlike a lot of other countries, China thinks over the horizon and plans over the horizon. And China is not Russia in so many ways. China is not Russia, and neither is the Ukraine Taiwan, by the way. So the differences are so enormous that you look at everything from military to economic policy. Russia it's obvious, it's brutal, it's short term, it's here and now, and I want and I'll take. China is long term, it's sophisticated, it's subtle, it works in behind the radar, not above the radar. It's a completely different player, and the way it will go about Taiwan is an absolute reflection of that. I honestly do not believe that it would, in its wildest dreams, consider the best option for Taiwan would be to invade.
How do you think they'll eventually look to acquire Taiwan?
I think the strategy there will be exactly the same as it has been for Hong Kong, to gradually undermine the regime, to install its own politicians and officials in the government, and then eventually to change the sympathy towards reunification, so that eventually they will move that way, so that China can stage a silent takeover, exactly as it's done in Hong Kong. And I'm not saying the people in Taiwan will embrace reunification. They won't accept even this one China, two systems policy. The latest polls show that nobody believes that's going to happen after what happened in Hong Kong. But I do believe that China would much rather spend 20 years undermining public sympathy and politics in Taiwan and then just walk through the door than it would in trying a massive and potentially completely impractical amphibious operation.
You think that
the same goes for the economy that you were, the economic challenges that you were just talking about. They'll have a scenario which says, what if we end up isolated? And they'll have another scenario which says, who do we need on our side if that happens?
Do you think China is really concerned about being isolated or would be isolated? I mean, we just went through, well, we're still kind of somewhat in, is this COVID pandemic. And, however it ultimately occurred, it originated from China. And there's been essentially no full accounting or really anyone held accountable for anything for it. And this thing caused trillions upon trillions of dollars in damages and has really, altered the world. So I don't know, in a way, I don't know that China necessarily cares about public opinion. I think they just are of the mind of, well, you can't do business without us, so deal with it.
No, I don't think they care about public opinion, and I'd be interested to hear your guys' view on this. My view is that they care very much about how the world regards their place in the world, and especially in the region. They see themselves as rightfully or wrongly the preeminent power in Asia, and they have been since 1200 BC. Yeah. And from their perspective, this is not something that the rest of the world at the moment seems to get. And they want to be back in the eyes of the world as that preeminent power. So no, I don't think they care particularly what individual countries or their own people think, but they do want to be regarded as the regional power that they see themselves to be. Yeah.
Now, on the converse side of for you, Humphrey, given what's been going on in Ukraine with the war, and Russia and China's kind of cozy relationship they have had for some time. We saw prior to the Olympics ending, it was right around the end of it, where China and Russia kind of reaffirmed a much deeper alliance, both economic, technology, and potentially the military, just before the Russian invasion. How do you think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is affecting that relationship with them now? And do you think that maybe the Chinese have a regret for that? Or do you think the Chinese are of the mind of, well, let's see how this shakes out and see if there's some way to make this a benefit for us?
Yeah, I'm very much TJ on this, is that they're playing a long game. So they're definitely sitting and watching at the moment. And they are going to watch on a number of things about how much the West is actually united in the long term. You mentioned they've just been suspended. That is it. They've just been suspended. All this could flow back tomorrow. They're also looking at the sort of resistance that's coming up there, in case, there are hawks in the Chinese military that want to do the Taiwan thing, and they've been held back for very good reasons on that. And also they're looking at their relationship with Russia as to whether there is an authoritarian alliance that has got some sort of doctrine that can compel other countries of the world, to join them in that. And they've been fairly successful in that over the years. But I think there are a couple of things to look at here. And basically their votes in the United Nations General Assembly. There was the vote about the very little and underreported Chagos Islands. This is Britain's claim to bits of the Indian Ocean that have got the Diego Garcia American base in it, which Britain claims, and 2 international courts have found that those claims are illegal. That was put to the to the United Nations General Assembly, and Britain could only get 6 votes in favor, and there are 100+ votes against. That was a couple of years ago. Then look at the General Assembly vote on the Ukraine. There were 141 in favor of condemning Russia, 35 abstentions, and I think Russia had Syria and North Korea and Eritrea, and that was about it. So if you're looking, or if China is looking at winning the imagination of the world and being seen, as TJ said, putting up there as the preeminent power because the way it runs things and its doctrine is right, it has to look at that global opinion element there, of which is being played out in the Indo-Pacific at the moment. So in what has happened in Ukraine is that Russia has crossed a line which China is finding, I think, very difficult. And they have a thing in China about trying to avoid chaos.
Yes.
One, which comes from the Cultural Revolution. They never want to be in that situation again. They've had a lot of chaos thrown at them in the past few years. They've had Trump, who came out of nowhere. They've had the Myanmar thing. They would have preferred Myanmar to just muddle on, but they've had the Myanmar. Then they've had Afghanistan, and now they've got Ukraine.
Oh, and don't forget North Korea.
Oh, they've had North Korea.
What about the situation with what about the situation with the Uyghurs in their Western provinces? Because what we've seen there is essentially, quite frankly, a genocide going on there, and horrific human rights abuses throughout that region, as well as others in the suppression of free speech and the crackdown and imprisonment of people that just are speaking against the government in Hong Kong. And so when you look at all those, I see China wanting to have this great global perception, but the reality is they are a brutal dictatorship that if you speak out against that regime, you just disappear. And so I kind of wonder how that plays into that, though.
Well, I think, James, that is the reality as seen from London and Sydney, or Sydney a little bit, they're coming around now, and Washington. I had a mate, I've got a lot of mates, as I think we were in Asia, and I had a wonderful conversation with a guy in Indonesia when the Hong Kong stuff was going on. And I said, why aren't you guys, supporting these people in Hong Kong? And he said, are you kidding? He said, we've had to put up with this shit all our lives. This is what we do. We have to deal with corruption. We have to deal with dictators. We have to do all this stuff. Those guys there, they're in Asia. They've had it so good for so long. We're not going to risk our, mechanisms of corruption and bribes and whatever that we all live with in order to do that. And on the Uyghur thing, and I'm not talking as a moralist. I mean, I don't think that those are concentration camps and they shouldn't exist. But I'm just telling you how the region thinks of it. Is that the criticism against the Uyghurs is coming from the Western capitals. It's as the West sees the world. It's not as Asia sees the world. And this is the point that China and Russia, to an extent, has been trying to ram home in those Western capitals for the past 20 years, 30 years, is that, take it gradually. Don't tell us to do all these things at once. And, you get into a tricky situation when you have these conversations, because then you get accused of being pro-China. That's not the case. What I'm saying is, yes, Hong Kong is breaking the law. The concentration camps are wrong. They should be stopped somehow. But how do you stop them in an effective way? How do you make sure these things don't happen?
But do you go the same way? I mean, we've determined the way to chastise and punish Russia for its invasion of Ukraine is you just sever ties and you try to make it economically painful. So wouldn't those same types of positions, if they're good enough for Russia, wouldn't they also work towards China? Trying to help change behavior.
No. Look, you've done. Russia's been through it. China was wise enough to step back. Russia tried democracy, and it became a mafia state.
Yeah.
Putin ended the mafia state and became a Hitlerian dictator. Okay, and the debate in the think tanks in Washington and London and that hasn't changed. It's all democracy, democracy, democracy. And until the mindsets change, then you're not going to get a solution to this situation.
But do you think that means the West is eventually just going to have to come around and accept that, because of China's regime and their type of government, that, slave labors and camps and, these policies that they do against their own people are just going to have to be an accepted way of life? And we're just going to have to say, well, we just have to accept this if we want to do business with them, and it's happening in their country, not ours, so it's okay.
I'd like to hear what TJ says about it.
You're more present there. You have to deal with that stuff.
No, I think
dig myself in any deeper.
No, I'm 100% with you, Humphrey, on this, because I think the entire Western criticism of China around the Uyghurs, or pick any other human rights issue in China, is a flea biting a dog. And their focus is not on what their perception or the perception of the world from the West towards China. Their focus is on their regional partners. Yeah. And Japan doesn't give two thoughts about the Uyghurs. And I did an assignment. I was lucky enough to do an assignment in Taiwan 2 weeks ago. I spent 10 days there, so not a massive amount of time, but I interviewed about 50 people, and we were talking everything from politics to business. I can guarantee you that the general person in Taiwan and politicians in Taiwan, they're not thinking about Uyghur politics and the situation of the Uyghurs. They have their own concerns, and whether that's Taiwan, Japan, Indonesia, India, these are the people that China is looking to in terms of how are we able to influence them, and how are we able to manipulate or achieve the type of aims that we have for cooperation with those countries. The West is somewhere we sell our products to.
I think I'd just like to add a little bit into what TJ said, James, is that the Uyghur camp thing is not an ethnic thing, although it is a bit. It's not trying to wipe out the Uyghurs. It's trying to stop a Syria or an Iraq erupting in Xinjiang. Mm-hmm. And when I've hosted panels where I've had the anti-China people on the panels, I've said, okay, so if you take a Syria and if you take a Xinjiang and you're looking forward to your grandchildren, which one would you want there?
Yeah,
and they don't have an answer for that.
Yeah.
That's the problem. I'm not saying, you know, I condemn the concentration camps. I wish that the Chinese had done it differently, but this is what they do to their own people too. It's what they did in the Cultural Revolution. It's the way the Chinese are. So it's not a Holocaust situation this yet. It might become one, but it's not. They treat the Han Chinese, if they go against the government, exactly the same way that they're treating the Uyghurs.
Interesting perspective. And this is why I like being able to talk with people specifically from different countries and regions of the world, because we all have different news that is being fed or pushed towards us, which in time does start to create an internal bias or opinion of particular topics. I know in my own country, we are very, very polarized and tribalized with our media and social media, the legacy media and then the social media side of the house. And that has unfortunately become worse and worse every year with the information that's fed to us. It's become very difficult at times to know what is actually correct and what actually is truth, because there's a bit of, every lie has a bit of truth in it. And so it is kind of challenging to see that. I guess there's a few aspects of that situation I hadn't really considered from your guys' point of view. We obviously in the US had a very unique history with slavery. And so from our perspective, the very idea and concept of concentration camps and slave labor and sweatshops is just absolutely, immoral in our eyes. So I guess from our point of view, we find it very difficult to accept that kind of behavior from any country, regardless of who it is. But that is not an opinion that is necessarily shared with other countries around the world. But more importantly, it's not something that really you can affect or change. So why become upset over it in a way? Yeah, it's an interesting point. But I guess circling back more to the Ukraine aspect of all of this, with things going forward, what do you think China is going to do with their relationship with Russia? Do you think they are going to maybe go along with the West's pressure to continue to isolate Putin, or do you think that they may attempt to give Putin more of an out and essentially look at Russia and Putin in the same vein that they look at Kim Jong-un in North Korea, where we can use that situation to cause problems and stir things up while we do something over here. And now we can essentially do the same thing with Russia and bail them out and then subsequently make them our pawn because they are indebted to us. Do you think that that might be an angle the Chinese may attempt to look at or try to manipulate going forward with the Russians? I mean, I don't know which one you guys want to, tackle that one.
I'll I mean, I think that they will dump Russia's the wrong word, is that they'll use that alliance to their own advantage in a very clever way. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Chinese media over the past couple of weeks, it has been strangely, it's still critical of America, but the level of criticism has been toned way down. Mm. If you also look at the national, the White House put out a white paper during the Olympics. It was just before the Ukraine invasion about the Indo-Pacific, but they also toned down the rhetoric about China itself.
Yeah, and we've shied away from calling out their human rights abuses and stuff, and we're now trying to just
all of that is so Asia, the Indo-Pacific, which is a sort of new region. China is part and parcel of it, but it is not the big thing there that has to be reacted and responded to in this white paper. Mm. So all this has taken place in the past month, and there has been a lot of communication between the United States and China over the Ukraine issue. Mm. So where does that lead? I don't know what happens because the Russians have got their own agenda. We don't know how stable or unstable Putin is, but I suspect that if he was a madman with his finger on the button, he would have been gone by now. So he has the Russian institutions behind him. But this idea that you were talking about, James, earlier, about based on the SWIFT thing.
Mhm.
This won't. These are very complex arrangements to set up, and they need to be set up with mindsets that need discipline and compromise and national governments working together. And China has very little experience in that, as does Russia. So to set up something that works as efficiently and smoothly as SWIFT, no. As same way as to set up all the other things that keep the world order is kept running by a whole lot of little widgets like air traffic control that we don't even think about, and there's no way that Russia and China are going to set up something that can compete with that.
Yeah, I think the question of whether Russia becomes closer to China or stays the way things are today is an absolutely critical one for the future. So I think it's a good one for you to raise. The signals that I'm seeing is that China regards Russia a little bit like a dance partner who can't actually hear the beat.
Yes.
And they're finding them very, very difficult to dance with. And China has this big emphasis on sovereignty, which Russia just went in and completely trashed. China has this strong belief that you shouldn't interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. They expect that from other countries towards them.
Yes.
They try and show that themselves to some extent. And then Russia just completely tramples all over that. Very inconvenient for China. But at the same time, if you look at where Chinese state media at the moment has its journalists embedded, it's in Russian forces. So they have their state media embedded with Russian forces. They don't have their state media across the border in Ukraine like the BBC does. And interestingly, the BBC, I don't believe, has journalists embedded in the Russian side. So it's easy to see there where China has put its money in terms of whose side of this story we're going to cover. So I don't think there's any doubt that they see a certain sympathy for Russia, but it's an inconvenient alliance for them at the moment.
And you brought up an interesting point earlier in the conversation where you were saying that you believe that the Chinese are a lot more averse to using force or the military option than other countries are, because they would be more apt to just over time, just essentially the Mongolian concept of just assimilating them. And that's how you defeat them. And that's not a bad approach. It's a very long approach to make happen, though. But part of me really does wonder, though, if an opportunity presents itself, would they not just try to seize it and not go through a 20 or 30-year route where they can't predict what can happen in the future?
Yeah, my opinion on that is actually just based on the fact they haven't been in a war since 1979.
Yeah,
since they went across the border into Vietnam, they simply have not engaged in military conflict as a solution to any of their diplomatic issues. Obviously, on small scale they have, and they're not particularly friendly towards neighbors on their border in India and Nepal. But in terms of significant military operations, zero. And you look at the words of Xi Jinping, he talks about the new era for China being ahead of them, but he doesn't put a time limit on that. And yes, although sometimes he talks 2035 and 2050, he's not going to be here in 2050.
No.
And he knows that. Now, he might get reelected or reappointed at the next Chinese Communist Party meeting this year. That will basically be electing him for life. So he is thinking long term. Putin is probably elected for life, but he spends his entire time looking over his shoulder at who's coming to kill him. Xi Jinping doesn't have that danger. He doesn't have that problem. He will be there for life if he chooses to be there for life. And he's setting China up for this new era of prosperity where he will be one of the founding fathers.
Yes.
And that isn't accelerated, or it doesn't need to be accelerated by a military misadventure, which Taiwan has the risk of being.
What do you think they're trying to do, though, recently with Taiwan? Because lately we've seen the Chinese flexing a lot of muscle in that particular region, violating the Taiwanese Air Force, the air corridors, and not sending like onesies and twosies of aircraft, sending 30, 40 plus aircraft into these zones, and then also testing the same type of responses in zones against the Japanese disputed islands. So I mean,
I think Humphrey said it before. There are people in the Chinese military who certainly would like to take a crack at Taiwan, and they would be constantly testing Taiwanese defenses, air defenses, naval defenses. What we don't see is what's happening under the water. So, they will be constantly testing Taiwan and looking for weaknesses. They would also be looking for weaknesses politically. So, do their incursions provoke uproar in Taiwan, or do they basically, which seems to be the case? To give you an example, when I was interviewing people and we were chatting casually, I said to them, what did you think about the fact that in October, China sent 50 airplanes into your airspace in the space of a few days? Their response was, did they?
Gotcha.
They
So
what?
it's just the West that seems to be hyping this up more so than their own local media even.
Well, I think...
Yeah, go on, Humphrey.
No. So I was just saying that they're also testing the American resolve. So what this is doing is it is playing up, as you say, James, in the Western media, and they're teasing out this constructive ambiguity policy is being teased out to give it less ambiguity. And I think that it's useful for everybody, actually, because it's useful for the more moderate people in Beijing to say, look, if this does happen, you're going to be fighting America, so that the Hawks can carry on their war games there. But the message that gets up to Zhongnan High is, no, we don't want to do this because it will be a new Pacific World War, and we don't want to get into that. So I think that, and because these incursions are sort of carefully choreographed, and the elections are carefully choreographed in the social media and that, and the banning of tourists going to certain constituencies that are going to then elect pro-Beijing politicians, all that. And I think, as TJ said, let that play out over 20 or 30 years, and you get this thing called, I think it's peaceful nonviolence or something. That is the way they took Beijing. So you surround it. You bring people over to your side, you win people over, and then eventually you can walk in, and not everybody's going to like it, but there won't be any bloodshed and no buildings will be destroyed. Yeah. Taipei 101 will continue to stand.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that struck me now, looking at what's happened in Ukraine and what the conversations were I was having with Taiwanese people a couple of weeks ago. Taiwan is actually in exactly the same situation as Ukraine was before the Russians came over the border. They do not believe that China will invade. Yeah. They have no desire whatsoever to be part of China. They don't believe in the one China, two systems policies would work. But at the same time, they honestly do not believe that China is going to come storming across the strait with aircraft and ships anytime soon. And you can see that even in their conscription policy. The people that I talk to have national conscription, national service. It's 4 months.
Wow. No time.
I was in 4 months compulsory military service. Yeah. I was in Korea back in October, and they have 2 years.
Yeah.
Now that's what when I said Ukraine is not Taiwan, Taiwan is also not Korea. Korea honestly believes that at any moment, the entire North Korean army could come charging across the DMZ, and they would need to be ready.
Yeah.
And all of their military preparations reflect that. They have a conscription length of 2 years compared to Taiwan's 4 months. If you're putting your people through a 4-month conscription program, you're not taking the threat of invasion seriously.
Yeah, in like American military training itself, is typically 4 to 6 months for most job occupations. So yeah, that's not even enough time to train. But that also brings up another question about this. So there's a lot of talk about the porcupine theory. That's what General Petraeus has talked about. I got the opportunity to actually work for General Petraeus at CENTCOM for a little while before I went to Europe. And he was kind of a big believer on this regional security architecture plan I got lucky and I was actually to export that to Europe, and we really developed that a lot in Europe before he ended up going to Afghanistan. But his whole idea was, you follow the special forces philosophy of by, with, and through. And basically what we do is instead of trying to be everywhere at once, we try to train up partners that can stand on their own to be able to do that. And so the porcupine theory was what we should have done in Ukraine, if we were not going to accept them into NATO, was to so massively arm them that they become a giant porcupine that the Russians just wouldn't want to deal with. And now the real pressure right now is because that didn't occur in enough time with Ukraine to stop the Russians. There's a lot of pressure right now in our politicians to get the Biden administration to rapidly implement that in Taiwan, which is why they're expediting the sale now of Abrams battle tanks, a bunch of new F-16 Vipers, and getting their Air Force substantially better prepared. Do you think that that is actually a bad thing to do? That it's just going to instigate or push things further with China, when in reality the Chinese and the Taiwanese don't really believe there ever will be a war?
It's an interesting mind game to play, isn't it? Imagine if you had a Ukraine that, like Taiwan, was armed with Patriot missiles, that all along the Azov Sea had Harpoon missile systems, that its air force was not Cold War Russian, but was rather, as you said, the newly upgraded F-16s. If the Javelin missiles that we're flying into Ukraine right now, the Ukrainians had been training on for the last 5 years. Imagine if Ukraine had been armed to the teeth the way that Taiwan is and has been, would it have been even part of the battle plan for Ukraine that they would go in the way they have? For the Russians would go in the way they have. I think the porcupine analogy you just raised is absolutely perfect. If you're China and you're looking at Taiwan, you see one mother of a porcupine over there. And that's not even taking into account whether or not whether
or not the US would come to
the Americans would pile in behind them. I mean, they've got 30 something fast attack boats, each armed with 4 sea skimming missiles. They have 4 submarines. 2 of them are training submarines. They have 4 submarines. They're building another 8 right now. Their chances of getting across the Taiwan Strait without getting decimated are pretty low. And even if they park their 3 aircraft carriers off the coast, they're not surrounding Taiwan on all sides in terms of a land invasion. It's a big porcupine.
But do you think the Taiwanese really view this as something that needs to be done, though? Because if the mindset amongst the general population, I don't know if that's the same mindset with the politicians, is that the reality of war is just not really going to happen. And if Xi's ultimate plan is, well, we have a 30-year plan, we really don't care about trying to militarily conquer them. We're just going to assimilate them over time. Is the porcupine necessarily something that should be done? Is it something that may actually cause a war as opposed to de-escalating one?
I mean, every time that there is a sale of any note, has been since the One China policy started, there's always rhetoric that goes backwards and forwards on it. And sometimes stuff happens. I mean, when I was last Taiwan back in 2019, and we were with the Defense Ministry, and I asked them what sort of weapons they wanted, they said, we'll start making our own soon, but if you could give us 1 million sniper rifles, that would be useful. And the guys, the training that they're doing, part of the training, I don't know if it's the National Service, is counterinsurgency training up in the mountains. And one of the people that was sitting there at the dinner, there was a lot of wine being drunk and everything, I'm sure, as TJ knows, but said, yeah, we'll make the Iraq insurgency look like a kid's picnic compared to what we'll do to the Chinese. So coupled with the porcupine, even if you go through the porcupine, you're not going to get any soft, you're going to get an insurgency. So coupled with an insurgency which could go on for 10, 20 years or more, if you wait that 20 or 30 years and do the non-peaceful measures, it's called the non-peaceful measures of surrounding it, persuading it, cajoling it, and then doing it, you're probably in a much wiser position there. I just want to say, so when I was researching my book, Asian Waters, and I was talking to an old Chinese general, and he was down in there in the 50s, there was a time when they were bombing Jinmen in the 50s that Eisenhower came within a signature of authorizing a nuclear strike around Xiamen. The bombers were taken from what's now PACOM to Okinawa and the Philippines, and they were going to go in and do it. And Eisenhower said to his generals, commanders, he said, you know, this is a different type of weapon. We don't just use it like that. And they said, no, we use the best weapon we've got. And he said, no, I'm not going to authorize that to happen. And Khrushchev then actually sent a note through saying he, went through he said, look, we would, if a nuclear attack on China would be considered to be a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. That was in 58.
Wow.
62, when China went into India, there was no such backing for China at that stage because the Sino-Soviet pact had collapsed. And exactly that, the guy was relating this to me, was one of those retired journalists, obviously sent down to tell me this. And he said, we backpedaled from then, from India, because we thought that Kennedy would nuke us. And what's not really talked about and little known is that invasion of India, incursion of India, was timed precisely to match the Cuban Missile Crisis. They went in on the day the blockade started, and they withdrew the day the blockade ended.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the Chinese, if you threaten them or if you warn them, they will backpedal. Yeah. They won't self-destruct like the Communist Party. Let's put it that way. They won't self-destruct, in my view, like Russia is self-destructing now. And they'll dump Russia if they see that it's going to threaten the Communist Party. So if you get the sort of sanctions that produce social unrest and people get kicked out of work and all of that sort of stuff, the stuff that the Trump trade deal began to, trade things started to happen, then the Communist Party's survival is tantamount. And what they won't tolerate or what they won't allow to happen is social unrest caused by people that are out of work.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
That went all over the place, but that was...
No, but that's a good point. You see, this is not the kind of perspective that we hear inside America, and it's not the kind of perspective that a lot of the people I know have about that situation. But I think that a lot of you guys from Australia and Great Britain understand the Asia situation perhaps a lot better than we do, because you have a longer history in that theater than we do. There's a lot more cultural ties and relations and just history there than what we have.
Can I just ask, that Taiwan nuclear thing was recently, well, not recently, declassified, I think 2009, is within the National Security Archives in Washington. Which
50-year rule, yeah.
TJ, did you have to do 2 weeks quarantine to go to Taiwan?
No, I didn't go in person. I did it all virtually.
Oh, you did it virtually?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Which meant getting up at 3 in the morning, but
yeah. Wow.
Okay.
No, and the same goes for China at the moment. 2 weeks in a 1-star airport hotel.
No way, no way. Too old for that.
Yeah, right. Younger days, maybe. I'm too old for this now. So we've been talking for almost an hour, and I want to ask you guys one last question. And this is just me as an American trying to ask to get an honest foreign perspective of our country and some of perhaps the policies that we have taken. And that is not something that an internal American can necessarily give a good opinion on, because ours is going to always be American focused or American derived. When you look at the United States from outside, do you guys believe that the US is right or wrong, or perhaps should change and evolve in its perception or its belief that it should somehow be the global policeman or the guarantee of, democracy and settling disputes and just generally putting its foot into every little problem and situation around the world? Or do you think that the US, maybe that was okay for a period, but as we enter the the next century, the 21st century here, that maybe something needs to be changed or adjusted?
I can see that the wise man is silent there, so I'll go first, and then TJ.
There's no right or wrong answers there. It's just really, it's about really understanding an outside perspective from other points of view.
Well, the two key areas of the world haven't yet managed to get united or sophisticated enough to do what the US is doing. So whether the US wants to do it or not, we need it to do it, because Europe, the US is leading on Ukraine. The US led on Bosnia. The US led in the Second World War. The US created the European Union. The US created NATO. And we in Europe keep talking about a European army, and we haven't managed to get around to it. And the European Union, well, Britain's now left it, so that's not what you'd call a united front to stand up to something like China or Russia. And over in the Indo-Pacific, because Japan and South Korea can't get rid of their past things, there's not even a defense alliance between them. All the defense alliances in the Indo-Pacific go to the Pentagon. Yeah. They don't go between each other. So it's not really the US's fault, if that's the right word. It's that nobody else has managed to rise up to take on that job.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that, TJ?
I think it's interesting that that you use the words global policeman, because it implies that that the US is acting in some sort of self-sacrificing way rather than in its own self-interest. And seen from our perspective as a very strong US ally in Australia, there's not been a single war you've gone to that we haven't been at your side.
Or gotten dragged into, basically, yeah.
I think we pretty much always stuck a hand up pretty quickly, unfortunately or fortunately.
We didn't do Vietnam, did we?
Yeah, that's right. But most of these situations, even Bosnia and the Ukraine, it is in the US economic interest for trade and relations to be smooth. And these companies that are now pulling out of Ukraine are not doing it out of a desire to punish Russia as much as a desire to please Washington, perhaps, but they would much rather prefer that relations in Europe were smooth. Wars in the Middle East are generally not fought over land in the Middle East as much as they are in terms of oil. And the idea that the US is a world policeman, I think, is interesting if you look at the root cause of that, which is, of course, the world, the economy works better if the world is at peace.
Yeah.
I think there's another element here which is really interesting, and that's the whole idea of empire and the collapse of empire. Mm-hmm. And one of the dangers, I think, seen from the outside, that the US needs to be very mindful of is that in any empire, which the US is at the moment, the peak of your military power also coincides with the start of your decline. And there's probably a correlation there that's not cause and effect, but US at the peak of its military power, it's not necessarily at the peak of its economic power, and it's constantly having to assert itself in the political sphere in order to maintain the perception that it is a political power. And those things are very, very, very difficult to balance when you're here at the tip of your power. China has been through several peaks and troughs, and I think one of the interesting lessons from China is that over 2,000, 3,000 years of history, they have been down a long way and come back up again. And I am a little bit worried about the US overextending itself at the moment by getting too involved. And I do actually have a lot of sympathy for the, it's not an isolationist perspective, but I
Correct.
think it's more of a resource intelligent perspective to say, maybe Ukraine isn't our war.
Yeah.
Maybe it is, but maybe it isn't our war. Maybe Europe should have to step up there. Maybe Taiwan won't be our war. Because if we're going to do that, what damage are we doing to ourselves?
That's what we're asking ourselves right now with Russia, and that's why I kind of wanted to ask your guys' opinions and just thoughts on what you think of that. I know from the American side, it's not, you hit the nail on the head. It's not so much an isolationist desire, so much as it is a realization of we have just so overcommitted ourselves the last 30 years that we are unable to really handle domestic issues, domestic affairs. You know, we spend $760 billion a year on defense because we are on the hook to protect 30, almost 40 countries around the world. Well, we can't protect all of those countries and guarantee their security if we don't maintain a certain level of military power. And that power requires an astronomical amount of money. And when we look at NATO, we love having the boys club of the alliance, but we look at the alliance and we say, what do you contribute outside of basing rights? You know, you can't provide military support that's actually of value or use because you don't invest in your military. You, like Germany just had to admit that they don't have a military right now that can fight, that can contribute to fight against Russia if they invaded NATO. Their 40+% of their air force is down for parts. Deutsche Bahn, the Deutsche Bahn came out and acknowledged that they only have a handful of actual transports that could move German armor units outside the country without having to have them drive on roads. There's so much that the NATO alliance has just allowed to atrophy since the fall of the Soviet Union, that it's put in an enormous pressure and strain on the US to essentially pick up the entire slack. And after 7 years of Iraq, 19 years of Afghanistan, it's just an exhaustion period, you know, just reached a level of exhaustion where we're just like, you know, you guys have a $20+ trillion economy. You guys can handle this on your own. And why do we have to go back and fight a third war for you? You know, because our roads, our bridges, I mean, we need to invest in our own country a lot. And we have a lot of our own internal problems that we've just ignored at the, you know, to go do these foreign wars. And it comes back to, when do we ever focus on ourselves and take care of ourselves if we're so busy in the weeds of everyone else's affairs? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a 50-year-old way of thinking, though, to think that you can afford not to.
I know, because, and that's the problem. But you
because
see,
with the global economy
to.
is so interdependent that what happens in Ukraine actually will, and Europe will affect the US economy. So it's kind of an own goal not to be involved. At the same time, it saps your resources and your strength in order to be involved. So this is why empires collapse. Sorry.
No, it is, but it goes back to the whole point of, you know, you're right. You can't afford to not be involved because, you know, peace is good for the economy and for, you know, just general lifestyle. But the question comes back to, why does Europe not share that same view? Why do they not share that same value and willing to commit to make it happen?
If I could, I did a story. It was the height of the Iraq war. I interviewed two sets of students. Mm-hmm. One of them were at Georgetown. They were in the Kennedy School of International Studies. Sure. And one of them were at the EU has a school in Brussels. And I sat them down in the campus and I said to the Georgetown people, I said, okay, supposing you were now Colin Powell or George W. Bush, and this, what would you do? Each of them knew what they would do at that thing. They said, I would do this, or I would send in more troops, or I would withdraw the troops. They all had a view on it. Mm-hmm. I asked exactly the same question in the Brussels people, and they said, well, well, we'd hold a meeting and we'd have discussions, and then we would refer it up, and they couldn't make the decision.
Mm.
And Europe cannot make the big decisions.
Yeah.
America can. And the same in a when you're writing thrillers, since that's
Yes.
what put together, is that there's this old adage that if there's a man's running down a street in a thriller, in an American thriller, he's bringing out his gun to save the world or save somebody that's going to save the world. If he's doing it in a British thriller, he's running to catch a bus. and in Asia, it's a similar thing, and you see it in ASEAN. It's, we want a spirit of compromise, we want common ground, so therefore we are not going to go up there and take on anything that's divisive. Yeah. That is why the United States, with its, cut and thrust, 3 pillars of democracy, big debate, go for the jugular, they go for Nixon, they go for Trump, they go for Clinton. We wouldn't do that in Britain. Yeah. And God, they wouldn't do it in, they did it with Sarkozy and France, but generally speaking, you're not going to go and do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So it's a cultural thing, I think.
It is interesting. And I don't know, a lot of us Americans do kind of look at Europe and we just kind of scratch our heads and we're like, why you had a genocide, you had multiple genocides happening, hundreds of miles from Berlin, and you waited years until eventually America traveled 5,000 miles to do it for you. And it was one of those things of why,
Richard Holbrooke had to, Bosnia, tiny little civil war.
I know, it was horrible. I've been to Bosnia. I've been all over the
country. Had to come in and fix that. I mean, none of us could do it.
Yeah.
It was actually, I was ashamed because I covered Bosnia and I thought, why are the Americans doing this? It's a war in Europe.
Yeah.
Actually, we could have an entire panel over what's actually happening in Bosnia right now while the world isn't looking.
God, you certainly could. Are you involved with that? Are you?
I personally been to Kosovo. I think it's 12 times I've been to Kosovo. I've been to Bosnia a few times. I've been inside Serbia a few times, along the Preševo Valley and all of those other controversial areas with the MUP of all places. So I've been all over that region on all sides of the situation. And it is interesting how the whole thing has evolved, but it was surprising that it took place under Europe and Europe couldn't handle it. And the same thing we're seeing with Ukraine, and part of a lot of people's concern in our country is that there are situations being, I don't want to say socially engineered, but engineered to essentially draw us in or to line up and make an Article 5 violation happen to force the US into a situation it doesn't want to go into. And so it's kind of interesting to see how some of this plays out. For instance, there's no reason why Poland publicly said, well, we're going to send our MiGs to Ramstein to give to the Ukrainians. Well, they could just give the Ukrainians the MiGs right now and let them go. But they don't want to do that because they want it to come from America. So it automatically would force the United States into a situation it has no desire to get into. And I just think it's kind of like disingenuous and manipulative of some of the NATO partners to try to do that to the US. I understand why they're doing it. If I was in their shoes, I would do the exact same thing. I would do everything I could to get the US to go in and do this for me. But as an American, it's kind of frustrating to see it happening.
Like Churchill and Roosevelt, isn't it, in the Second World War?
Yeah. How do we get the Americans involved? And I was like, man, we got this attack and Japan's going to attack them. Should we tell them? No. Let's let this play out. Type of thing. Yeah. I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate being able to ask you guys just some different questions about this, focusing on a little bit of China and Asia and trying to understand what's going to happen. Because I can tell you on the American side, there is a ridiculous amount of conversation and talk about China going in and taking advantage of the situation, or whether they view Biden as weak or not, they view the situation as ripe for opportunity to make something happen. And there is a lot of conversation on our side of the aisle about arming them substantially more, and just making a very rock solid commitment to Taiwan as a further deterrence from China interfering. But there's also, thoughts that, well, what if the whole idea is to get the US involved in a war with Russia in Ukraine. And then that creates the perfect storm scenario for the Chinese to just grab Taiwan and know there is no help coming to help them, or anything else that they want to do.
I think it's an interesting game to play, to go from this big strategic level to the low level and look at what might be driving those kind of decisions. What would be the advantage for China to do that right now? Xi Jinping didn't even want Russia to interfere with his winter games.
No, he's very emphatic about that.
So that shows you how he's thinking right now. It's all bread and circuses in China at the moment, the way the economy is. So he needs to keep throwing circuses at his people, and he can't have anything to interfere with the living standards, as Humphrey was saying. He can't afford any social unrest.
Sometimes a war is a good distraction from domestic problems and errors, though.
He has another distraction right now. In September or October, I don't think the date's been named yet, he needs to concentrate on getting reelected.
And after that, he'll have more time and mobility to do something.
So the idea that he's thinking about Taiwan right now, I'm sorry, he would be spending 36 out of 24 hours on internal political maneuvering.
That's a good point. So maybe once he has secured his next term, that might open the door for something to potentially happen once he's solidified his seat, his reelection again.
I think all I'm saying is that it's not, from my perspective, something that's likely to happen this year.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that there are a couple of markers that I put down on what you said, James. Is one is that on the day that the Cuban blockade came in, as I said, China went into India. On that day, Kennedy took the time to call Jawaharlal Nehru and said, "What do you need? We'll send it." So if this distraction thing is not a distraction, the Americas got the systems that can deal with both. And on the leadership war thing, we've got to remember that Churchill was voted out of office.
Yeah, right after World War II.
1945, whilst the Pacific War was going on, because the British people wanted someone to build up the country. They didn't want a warmonger anymore. So I would think that if Xi Jinping looks at those two things, he'll just, as TJ said, he'll sit straight and make sure he's reelected, and that his people have got food and shelter and can buy mortgages in their flats and cars and that sort of thing.
That's actually a really refreshing opinion to hear. You know, I'm really excited to hear that opinion, because that's not what we've seen here, and it's actually really nice to get your opinions on that, because you probably are substantially more accurate about what will likely play out than what we're being spoon-fed here.
Who knows? Who knows? It's been great. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
So we'll end our recording here and potentially talk again on another topic about some of this.
Great to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you.